easier. Just keeps going back.
Okay, I believe we have done it, that we are streaming live on Facebook. This is good.
I can see it on your Facebook page right now.
Okay, well, it should be. Okay, we are live. Great. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this Facebook Live webinar with these incredible people from Southeast Alaska. We are with SEAC's Buck Lindekugel, Bryn Fluharty, and Sitka Conservation Society's Katie Riley, and we are so honored to be chatting with everybody tonight about the Roadless Rule, which I have a lot of excitement because I've been able to meet these incredible people in face-to-face when I was up there this summer, and have so much respect for you all, that you've been in this fight for so many years, and you're really bringing this huge issue to the forefront that I think many of us are completely unaware of what's happening to the largest national forest in our country. I know for me, I came into this knowing about this issue through speaking with Tom Waldo, who's an attorney with Earth Justice. And when he explained to me that our largest national forest is being logged, the old growth forests are being logged, which is also subsidized by our taxpayer dollars, I was absolutely shocked, and I wanted to learn more. And so that was part of the reason that I went to Southeast Alaska, to be on the ground with the people on the front lines, to really understand what is at threat, why is it at threat, what are some of the public processes that we can actually be involved with and use our voices, because we have to remember, this is our public lands. Yes, this forest is in Alaska, but we actually all have responsibility as US citizens to be involved and to stand up for these forests, because this is one of the last intact ecosystems in the world. There are still salmon runs. There are still grizzly bear and eagle that live and thrive in these places. And here I am in California with a grizzly bear on my flag of this state, and we don't have grizzlies left. And the salmon are hardly coming back. And so what are we going to do, a lot of us in the lower 48, with this cautionary tale of what can happen to thriving ecosystems? The whole Pacific Northwest, California, Oregon, Washington was salmon nation. And that is no longer the case. So it's imperative that we get involved if we say that we care about these creatures, if we say that we care about intact ecosystems, carbon sequestration, and also the people that are living up there, the Haida and the Tlingit, the fisher folk, the people on the front line actually dealing with these issues on a day-to-day. We need to listen to them to understand what we can do, whether you're in Alaska or you're down in the lower 48 or wherever you are in the world that you're tuning in. It's really exciting to be able to talk about this and actually empower ourselves, because I know that these public processes are so convoluted, and there's a reason for that. It's by design. And so we really want to go through this webinar and start to break down how it is that we actually get involved, what all these things mean, what does this mean, these public commentary periods. And I'm really, personally excited to really understand, because I don't want to feel disempowered like I'm sure many of you do when we're up against these megaliths of these steals of public land. How do we actually get involved? So I was thinking that through this webinar, just to start with, I would like to give some context to the Roadless Rule. And well, actually, I don't want to give context. I want to hear from you all the context of Roadless Rule. And perhaps we could start with you, Buck, because you've been on this for such a long time. And perhaps you could give us a bit of an overview, a meta view of the past, present, and we can go into the future later. But just to understand the past and the present of what's been happening with the Roadless Rule for 17 plus years, and what's been happening in those past 17 years, and where are we at today? What are we up against?
Well, the the Roadless Rule came about at the end of the Clinton's second term. Okay, 2000 and 2001, they went through the planning process that came up with the final Roadless Rule in 2001, right before President Clinton left office. And in that decision, the Forest Service decided, in response to a lot of public support, to include the Tongass in the Roadless Rule. And what the Roadless Rule does is prohibit logging and associated road building in inventoried roadless areas in order to preserve their ecological function. That's the shorthand version. These roadless areas support diverse populations of fish and wildlife. They support sacred sites to native peoples, cultural resources, etc. Carbon too. The Tongass is America's largest store of carbon. We're the carbon life raft for America. And at this time of uncertainty and rapid change, it's really important, I think, for us to manage this resource for the long-term benefit of all Americans. And that's what the multiple use sustained yield debt is all about. That was the authority that the Forest Service used to promulgate, how's that for a lawyerly phrase, to promulgate the Roadless Rule in the first place, to protect our long-term interests in maintaining these incredible wildlands. So that's where we started. Almost from the moment it was approved, they had opponents to the rule that went to court, including the state of Alaska, including the state of Wyoming, the state of Idaho, challenging the rule. And after initial injunction against implementing the rule, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the rule as lawfully issued by the Clinton administration. And then things shifted back to the courts. The state of Alaska settled its case with, let's see, I left out the gap about President Bush stepping into power, and he appointed Mark Ray as Undersecretary of Agriculture. Mark Ray negotiated with the state of Alaska, and they came up with a solution to the lawsuit, the Alaska state lawsuit, that they agreed to start an exemption process, okay, to consider exempting the Tongass from the rule. And they completed that in 2003, very short time, less than 18 months from when they announced the proposal to issuing the final rule. And under that rule, the Tongass was removed completely from the Roadless Rule. Now, fortunately, we overturned that decision. We got it overruled by the courts, and we have roadless protection on the forest again. During that time when the Roadless Rule wasn't in effect, there was very little logging that occurred in roadless areas on the forest, primarily because of strong hearts here in Southeast who fought to protect those watersheds that are so important for them for food, livelihood, and culture, traditional uses. So that got us all the way up. We had the rule in place. The Forest Service amended the forest plan to add layers of protection on to the Roadless Rule and to incorporate those Roadless Rule protections into its transition away from old growth logging to more young growth, okay, to start to make a transition, they called it, from old growth logging to young growth logging.
And what Buck's talking about there is the Tongass Land Management Plan, which is a separate piece of policy around on the Tongass, and so that it's informed by the Roadless Rule, but is not actually part of the rule.
Exactly. Every national forest operates under a national forest plan, okay? A plan that the Forest Service adopts after going through public process and getting input from communities, et cetera. So they're separate, but they're parallel, and they overlap in terms of protections on these key pieces of land. So after the state of Alaska, after they lost the case on the Tongass exemption, filed another lawsuit. And this lawsuit they filed in the district court for Washington, D.C. They went clear across country, forum shopping for a favorable court, and they were unsuccessful. The court found all their claims meritless. So claims that there was dramatic social and economic upheaval, that the timber industry was being thwarted by this rule, that the rule violated the Tongass Timber Reform Act or the Alaska Lands Act of 1980. The court was unpersuaded and ruled against them. Within months of that decision, the state of Alaska filed its petition. In fact, within a month of the Trump administration starting, the state proceeded to file this petition and seek relief from the Trump administration, figuring that was a better chance, I think, than winning in court. They had been unsuccessful. Everybody who had challenged the roadless rule in court had been unsuccessful. And so they went around the courts. And they went back to the Trump administration. The Trump administration, despite no changes in facts, granted their request and initiated this rulemaking process to come up with an Alaska-specific roadless rule that at this point we don't know the outcome, okay, but the range of concerns would be a no action, where we leave the existing protections in place, to completely exempt all roadless areas from protection on the Tongass. So that's the big short story. Hopefully that I might have glossed over a few points, but
no, it's a good overview of where it was, how it's moved to where it is. And it's really interesting to hear that the people who were trying to overturn the roadless rule kept losing in court, because the court system was seeing that this roadless rule needed to stay in place, and all of these different tactics to now go to Washington, D.C. to try to get what they want. It's fascinating in a sick way to see how our system works. And Katie, I want to ask you, when Buck was saying they went here, who is they? Who are the people that are trying to question the roadless rule for an Alaska state roadless rule? Who are those people, and who are supporting them?
So if I understood correctly, I think you're asking, like, who is the impetus behind the state's pursuit of a Alaska specific roadless rule. And, Governor Walker has taken a lot of the flack for that, and that his administration is the one pursuing it. But from reviewing the materials that he submitted and the conversations and just the public knowledge of, what's been going on for the past 20 years, but also before that, it's pretty easy to deduce that the timber industry has a significant stake in this and is probably one of the most dedicated industries to opening up the Tongass from the roadless rule. Right now, the state is going around, they were going around and conducting these public meetings with communities throughout Southeast Alaska. The Forest Service was conducting them as part of the scoping process to get a feel for what people were thinking. And a lot of Southeast Alaskans showed up even during the end of the fishing season, the end of the harvesting season. It's a really important time for all of us. They showed up to express their opinions, and there was pretty heavy pushback against this idea. And while, the state representatives were unwilling to admit that they were maybe being guided one way or another, you can really tell from the documents that they're trying to stimulate and rebuild the forest products sector, which is the timber industry, that just hasn't enjoyed the levels of productivity that they had ever since, they cut down all the old economical old growth to begin with. So really trying to rebuild that industry that just doesn't really have a fighting chance in the old growth forests that are left. So.
But aren't how do I say this? Are trees not being logged in the Tongass even with the roadless rule in place? Isn't there still logging going on?
There is. Yes, there's the Tongass remains the only national forest that allows old growth logging and clear cutting to this day, but it's not enough. They do want more, and the Forest Service isn't really sure, or they're not divulging to the public exactly how much old growth is left. So you get a lot of just sort of economic development interests saying that the land is locked off and we need to open it up for to support these rural communities, but nobody has any idea except for the former biologists that used to work on these projects. John Shane is a good one, and he estimated that there's maybe 200,000 acres of this critical big tree old growth forest left on the Tongass. So that's really the land that they're looking for, and some of that is protected by the roadless rule. But yes, there are still timber sales occurring on Prince of Wales that are cutting down old growth trees and all over the Tongass, really. And that's why this transition that Buck was referring to is so important, and that was to transition out of the old growth market to a complete young growth market. And so this pursuit of the new Alaska roadless rule could involve a rewriting of that Tongass land management plan, and definitely would involve more old growth cutting than is currently included in it.
I went to one of the public meetings in Juneau, and I thought it was really strange how they were talking about overturning the roadless rule, but they weren't talking about the forest management plan. And when somebody raised their hand about the change of forest management plan, there was kind of this sloughing off. Oh, no, we don't know about that. And we're not going to talk about that tonight. But it's like, well, then what are we talking about? Why would we open up roads? Why would we build new roads if not to extract? What would be the point of spending money to open up roads if they weren't trying to extract trees? And I want to ask, a step further. To me, it seems that logging is the canary in the coal mine for mining. It seems that the roads are the first thing, then it's the trees, and then it's other forms of resource extraction, mostly for rare earth minerals. I'd love to hear all of your senses on where do you think this could go after logging? Do you see a larger, mining operations that are coming after the old growth would be logged?
So it's actually interesting that you mentioned that, and that sort of relates to the fact that we can sort of deduce that this effort to get rid of the roadless rule is mostly focused on stimulating this timber industry, because mining, hydropower development, interties, utility corridors, these are all allowed under the current roadless rule. There are exemptions in place. It cannot override the 1872 Mining Act. It can't override the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's ability to do hydropower development and actually build roads to access those areas. So really the only thing that you're not allowed to do in roadless areas is harvest timber and build roads. Mm-hmm. So we can, deduce that, if these areas were opened up and to old growth logging, and then the trees were gone, that more mining projects would probably sprout up to use those roads. But mining projects are already allowed under the current roadless rule. And so, we'll get into that later when we talk about comments, but people can actually advocate for a more restrictive rule. It doesn't have to be just this no action alternative that keeps the status quo in place. You can also tell the Forest Service that you don't want mining allowed in those lands protected by the new Alaska roadless rule. And that's definitely important. If you're got strong feelings towards extractive industries in general, and sort of the, you know, the lead on that those can cause, to point that out in your comments that we'll be working on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Hop on top of Katie there. Just to clarify one thing is, she's correct that the rule only prohibits logging. It doesn't prohibit mining or hydro development. And even if you say that you want a rule that prohibits mining and hydro development, the Forest Service couldn't approve such a rule, because Congress makes the laws that determine what happens or doesn't happen on national forest lands, not the Forest Service. They implement the laws. So there's just a little mush there that I hope I clarified. Sorry, Katie. But
No, right.
and it's you know, I think the issue is, this is about propping up an industry that is no longer competitive in the world markets, right? The Tongass timber industry, to even call them a timber industry now is pretty remarkable. They can't compete on the world market because they're so far from the market. Costs are so much higher up here. The season's short. It takes a long time for trees to grow up here. It takes us about 100 years to get our young growth to grow up to recut it. As you know, down the Northwest, it's, you know, much quicker down there to do it. And so they can pay for the roads. That's the other angle. And who's going to pay for these roads going into these roadless areas? Road building expenses are incredibly high up here. And, you know, this is another freebie for an industry that's never cared about about everybody else, but just their interest and taking care of that narrow interest. So they're kind of like, an analogy that might strike people is that they're like blacksmiths, okay, back in a century ago, that are no longer competitive in the world market, right? There's no more blacksmiths there. Yeah, there's a few guys horseshoeing, you know, but it's just, those days are over. And the large scale clear cutting on the Tongass is over, and everybody else has made the transition except for a few old diehards in the industry and the politicians who find it effective to support those.
Yeah, I really see that point, that it's a dying industry and there are a few people who are trying to hold on. And I wonder, when there is the debate, but it's economic development. But, you know, what I saw a lot of rhetoric about is this is for rural Alaskans. This is to help rural villages. You know, who's actually benefiting? Because I remember, and I remember, although I don't remember specifically the statistics around the people who actually are paid by the timber industry. And I remember the jobs that are created was a really, really small number. It was hardly really any jobs created. So a lot of the jobs were brought in from outside, the people in the community. I think, like, even in Prince of Wales, and maybe I'm misremembering this, but it was something like 26 full-time jobs. So something like that was kind of just a shocker. Do you have any of those more precise statistics of, you know, when they're trying to fight for this failing timber industry and they're trying to put it on the rural Alaskans and job creation, what are we actually looking at when it comes to that with old growth logging and keeping this timber industry alive?
So the numbers that we get from, it's called the Southeast Conference, and they put out an annual report called Southeast by the Numbers that specifically looks at our economy here in Southeast. And what you see is that, calculated out, it's less than 1% of the economy is actually based in timber. And it's somewhere around a little over 300 jobs throughout Southeast Alaska that are actually in the timber industry. And one of the things that is really striking is, in comparison, well over 20% of our economy is based around tourism and fishing, which are both dependent on a healthy Tongass National Forest. Yeah. And so that's one of the big reasons that you have a diversity of voices coming out, because there's a lot of concern about what a new roadless rule would mean. And because nobody's going to come up here to see just the bald hillsides, and it would be a really big hit on our tourism, and then also on our water quality and habitat for fish and wildlife.
Exactly.
So I want to start transitioning the conversation to the public process and what is the importance of people getting involved. But before we go there, I want to talk about this idea of the privatization of public lands, because when I was traveling around, something that I heard from people was this, not just fear, because it has happened, but that these public lands, especially when more of these rules get thrown out, the fear that these lands can be sold out to private timber companies. They can be traded for other deals that happened years ago. I think it was like the Mental Health Trust that was trying to get timberlands in, so there's a lot of these deals going on behind the scenes. And I am wondering if any of you can speak to the chances that the more deregulated the Tongass becomes, the more fear we have of the Tongass being taken out of federal hands and put into either state hands, and what would happen if that was the case, or even becoming privatized, certain tracts of land. Can we speak to that worry?
Well, there's a lot of worries that you've identified there, and I'll take a crack at it. I think it's first important that, yes, the Tongass is America's largest national forest, but it's more than that. It's also a native place. And before the white man came up here to Southeast Alaska, the natives had a vibrant culture that lived off the land, and they had a tremendous, for 10,000 years they lived here, and we turned it into the national forest, okay, by proclamation by Teddy Roosevelt, and so these lands are public lands now, but before that they were Tlingit and Haida lands. And I think it's just important for us to understand that the fact that they're national forests doesn't satisfy everybody, right? And we have to be aware that there are legitimate interests in people being able to use those lands. And we work with a lot of tribes here in Southeast Alaska that understand and appreciate the effort by the Roadless Rule to protect the lands that they depend on so much for. And so that's, and the issues about a state forest, or the issues about university lands, or an exchange for mental health trust lands, those have been around for several years, and they get introduced into Congress every session, and we fight hard to push back on it. And so far we've been able to safeguard the Tongass, and really that's happens because American citizens across the country get involved, and they get involved by calling their congressmen and their senators and say, what are you doing? You have to protect the Tongass. It's our forest too. And I think it's okay for people to let their representatives and senators know that they care about the Tongass and they want them to protect it. And it wasn't just within the last year. Senator Murkowski of Alaska proposed riders on the Interior Appropriation Bill that would have exempted the Tongass from the Roadless Rule by congressional fiat, and that was rejected. And it was rejected by the majority of our Congress people because their constituents called them and said, what are you doing? Don't let them do it. So it's an important voice for us to exercise our rights as citizens to seek redress from our government for concerns, okay? And so letting your legislative folks know that you care about the Tongass is important. Voting is important. Participating in this public process is important. The more people that voice their support for Tongass roadless areas, the harder it's going to be for them to articulate a reason why they should remove those protections.
And so to I think maybe more directly address your question, there is, sorry.
That's all right, Brent.
There have been concerns around transitioning land to the state, because one of the things with the Forest Service is that their mandate is to manage it for multiple uses. And so for other landholders, such as the state of Alaska, it would primarily be, in some cases, managed directly for timber as the primary user. And so there would be that concern, but like what Buck was saying, as national forest, there's more voices involved, and so there is a little bit more potency in what we can do, not only here in Southeast Alaska, but also because it is a national interest, and because it's not only Alaska's lands, but national lands, and everybody's taxpayer dollars as well. That's a pretty big one, where if you want to talk about responsible spending of taxpayer money, this is a really big issue where we're spending millions of dollars and seeing almost nothing in return. And so there's a lot of potency in that voice as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, Katie, I'd love for you to speak to these fears of privatization. And then also, we had such an incredible conversation a couple of days ago around the importance of people's engagement in this public commentary period, which is ending October 15th, which is really just a few days away. And if you haven't heard that this is happening, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why it's challenging to get involved with this. So, Katie, I'd love to just open the floor to you and hear your thoughts on the privatization, and then going into the importance of actually being engaged, and maybe take us through the steps that you've been thoroughly considering as you do your work and speak to people about this.
Yeah, so considering the privatization of public lands, privatization is a pretty complex issue up here in Alaska. And I know that you and your audience love the deep dive. That deep dive takes a long while to wrap your head around, especially with the inclusion of Alaska Native corporations in the conversation, and how they can also diverge from a general tribal interest and the difference between corporations and tribal governments. So it's pretty complex, but I guess one of the main fears for privatization is that if the land undergoes resource extraction, and you have on Prince of Wales, you have a lot of different landowners, and so they all have different regulations that they have to adhere to. If it's private land, if it's corporation land, they don't really have to adhere to a lot of the safety and environmental standards that the state does, and the state adheres to different ones than the Forest Service. So basically just that discontinuity between the regulations and the environmental protections that those lands see means that even if you are able to conserve and protect some lands, that fragmentation is really what we're talking about as a huge danger for the forest in general, because the fragmentation is what is going to decrease that ecological value and really make it hard. It's going to isolate species basically, and result ultimately in a much harder fight for survival for them, because they're only going to have small patches of land. So privatization, it's a worry, but right now, the bigger worry I would say is this corporate welfare that we are currently giving to the timber industry by, like Bryn and Buck said, subsidizing the roads that they're using. And basically paying for them at a loss, always at a loss. I think since 1982, the American taxpayers have lost over $1 billion subsidizing the Tongass timber industry. So that's definitely more of a fear now, but there are those privatization bills going through, the land swaps, and that's always something to keep an important eye on, because any further fragmentation is going to result in a more difficult time to preserve those really important ecological habitats that we're all focused on. And then as concerns to people's engagement, so right now is the scoping period, and scoping is a nice way to say like issue identification, deciding how big the inquiry should be or what the Forest Service needs to analyze. And so a lot of people that I've talked to, unfortunately, and I mean you included, got the impression that this comment period wasn't all that important. You know, there's going to be another one, and there's more opportunities to participate. This one on the 5th that's ending on the 15th, you know, it's not that important, but it's actually extremely important. It's probably the most important period, because by the time that the next comment period opens up, they'll already have a proposed rule and their preferred alternative. So this is really the only chance that people have to bring their ideas to the table. So like all those important things that you were talking about earlier that we depend on this forest on, fish production, you know, healthy ecological habitat for the wolves, the bears, the deer, everything that we harvest and depend on for our livelihoods, and also what the Tlingit, the Haida, the Tsimshian people depend on for their cultural way of life, you know, that all of those suggestions that we have towards management of those things, we need to include in this comment period, because this is really the only opportunity that we have to bring ideas to the table for the Forest Service. So that's why this period is so important in particular. And yeah, I hope that we can talk about how people can create a really effective comment. It's not as hard as the Forest Service would have you think, and that's what we've been listening and paying attention for, is so that we can guide people to have the most impact in this public process.
I want to talk about impactful public comments. I had heard, and maybe this isn't fully true, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but are the form letters not counted in the same way as a individually written out letter? And so maybe, you know, you could answer that for me, and then let's go into what does make a really good form letter. You know, why isn't it that hard? What actually has the most effectiveness for people to write about?
So I haven't actually signed a form letter in a long time, starting working at SCS. So I am not actually all that up to date on the contents of a lot of them. But a lot of form letters, you know, will say in general terms, like, we really love the Tongass, you know, it's a national cultural heritage. It has all this important habitat. Please don't log on the Tongass. Please keep the Roadless Rule intact, you know, and it's really easy for people to take the 2 minutes that it takes to fill in your information and sign that form letter. And you're like, pat yourself on the back. You contributed to the public process. Unfortunately, in this period of public comment, those form letters, like, they count as one, basically. So the Forest Service said that they've received 23,000 letters on the Roadless Rule so far, comments on the Roadless Rule. 600 of those were individual comments. Those 600 are really going to be the only ones that are having an impact, in the sense that hopefully, you know, among those 600 comments, people are proposing ideas or saying exactly what they want the Forest Service to understand. But all the letters that you sign that are just saying, like, I support the Roadless Rule, I mean, this isn't a voting process. Your votes don't count. This isn't like they're calculating how many people are in favor and how many people are opposed. They're actually just trying to identify issues for analysis. And that is what the scoping period is all about. So maybe at a later date, that form letter is going to have more impact if you submit that for the draft environmental impact statement that's coming out next summer. But right now, they want to hear issues about what they need to include in their analysis. So unless every single person is saying, you know, I want you to analyze how much Tongass or how much carbon the Tongass sequesters and what the value of that is in terms of ecosystem services. I want you to analyze the costs of road building in comparison to the timber revenue receipts that are received. You know, those are the really like specific comments that they're looking for. They emphasize that meeting after meeting, you have to be specific. And the other components that they said were you have to be reference a geographical area, and you have to provide a narrative. And so what they're referring to with that is sort of both a rationale for why you care about the places that you're talking about, as well as what activities do you want to see happen there. So, you know, instead of that form letter, what we're trying to do is create the possible responses that they really need to hear. And then putting those together to create individual comments is going to be, even though it might take, you know, a couple minutes longer, it's going to be that much more impactful because it's really going to expand the issues that they have to look at this point in time, which is what they're trying to figure out.
And I remember, Katie, you saying something about if we don't actually say these specifics in the form letter, and then next summer we go, well, why isn't this being talked about? And why, you know, and we have all our complaints at that point. Well, if we're not asking at this point, then we probably won't get what we want in the summertime when things roll around again. So I think it's that much more important that we do really be specific in the way that we're writing these form letters, because we don't want to have less options when the next public commentary period happens.
And so, I mean, I'm sure I gave you that terrible analogy about the Thanksgiving dinner, but I mean,
I loved it. Please
keep coming back to it. So this comment period is like, you know, you get to, it's a potluck. You get to cook a dish, bring it to the party, share it with others. Everyone brings something different. You all taste a little bit of each other's, you enjoy it. At the draft EIS opportunity, that's like showing up to a dinner that's already made for you. And you can say, oh, wow, I don't like any of the dishes here, but you can't bring your own meal. You know, that meal is being served to you. You basically have to eat it or shut up, you know, and that's really what's going on here. The options are already going to be on the table at the next comment period. And it's not going to be the time that they're going to be considering, you know, what to put in it. They're already going to have everything put together. So now is really the only time that you can bring that dish. You can say, look, you need to consider this idea. You need to talk about this. You need to analyze this. We really care about these places, and really naming where you're talking about. And I understand that for a national audience, you know, you're not going to be able to say a lot of the times like, oh, I recreate at Ushk Bay and I really love to go hunting there. There's a great deer population there. There's not that kind of specificity for people who haven't been to the Tongass before, but you can still be effective by referring to, you know, all the current inventoried roadless areas on the Tongass. That's sort of like Forest Service buzzword. That's basically everywhere that's currently protected by the Roadless Rule. If you say that, that means that you want that protected by the new Alaska rule. And that's going to apply to those Tongass-wide areas that it might be more difficult for people to point out specifically. So we don't want you to think that, oh, you got to be super specific means you have to go look at a map and name specific bays. You know, that's what people up here are doing because they are recognizing these places that are under threat, and they are recognizing what they've done there. You know, they do recreate there. They go there with their families. They go fishing there. They go hunting there. So leave that up to them to name those specific bays. But really, people who care about the Tongass in general, you want to point out that you care about all those inventoried roadless areas for what they are, which is, you know, habitat for these amazing populations of salmon and wildlife, and opportunities for recreation that maybe you one day hope to see, and, you know, really carbon sequester places that are, you know, helping not only Southeast Alaska mitigate and adapt to climate change, but also, like Buck said, a life raft for the entire United States. It's something like 10 to 12% of all carbon emissions in the United States are stored in the Tongass. So really, it does have a national significance, and that's something that everyone can point out and everyone can have a say in.
Thank you, Katie. That's such a good, and this is such a good empowering way to see this, that we need to speak up now. We need to really understand the issues, and it's not just protect the Tongass. It's protect the Tongass because A, B, C, and D. And then it also allows us to have a more connected relationship with this land when we start to understand the significance, when we start to understand all of the pieces that come together of why this place is so important to so important culturally to the Haida and Tlingit, important to the people, the local people who live there, who recreate, who create a life off of the habitat that, say, the salmon come home to. If the forest is completely destroyed and the watersheds are destroyed, and then the salmon can't return to spawn, we'll see collapse of fisheries. And honestly, fisheries are already having a really hard time through ocean acidification, through all the habitat that has already been destroyed, through so many pieces. So this isn't a time to make it more challenging for the salmon to return. That's not what we need to do here. We need to take every measure we can to protect the habitat for these creatures to keep going, because really the world relies on the Tongass being intact. And I really appreciate giving us tools. And Buck and Bryn, I would love to hear from you too, your thoughts and some empowering statements to give to the people who are listening of how to get involved and what are pieces that you think are really important. The other thought I was having is, just so that we kind of have some idea, what happens once the public commentary period ends? Now, the next year or so, the Forest Service and who else is looking at these comments? What do they do with these comments? And then, and I guess I'm also wondering, like, who, not that you need to name people, but who are the people that are looking at these things, creating the next draft, and who actually makes the decisions based off the next public commentary period? If we could just take a couple more steps through the process so we can really understand, start to finish.
So in regards to the comments, just like Katie was saying, it's really all about personalizing the message and saying that this is why I care. And so while it's great to have the opportunity to do form letters, it is really about taking that time and making it personal. The Forest Service actually has on their website this great map that you can actually drop a pin and make your comment on the map and really highlight some of the places that people care about around here and then why they care about them. And so making sure that they know that you took the time to do that is really, really helpful. And then
we have a link to that web page on our web page.
Yeah, so
to make it easy for folks to find.
There's a site called SaveOurRoadlessForests.com, and that will bring people to a form letter that you can actually amend. So it's a little bit friendlier than the Forest Service's page, but you can also just go directly to the Forest Service's Roadless Rule page, or do an actual snail mail letter into the Forest Service, and those are great ways to engage. In terms of next steps, Buck will be the one to answer that question.
Well, these scoping comments are going to go into the Forest Service, and they're going to analyze them, and then they will start preparing a draft EIS for public review and comment. And so this scoping process informs what they're going to come back to us with, and we'll have a chance, according to their schedule, next summer to comment on that draft EIS and argue, well, we asked you to bring this up and you didn't, or your rationale is bogus, or you didn't consider this information. And, all those things like you would on a draft statement. And then once that gets done, those comments will be evaluated, and the Forest Service is going to have to make a final decision. And that decision is going to have to be reasonable. And that means that it reflects the information they received from public comment and the stuff we put in the record. So it's they have facts to support their decision. And we think that's going to be tough for them to do because the industry is hanging by a thread. It's a tiny part of the economic puzzle here in Southeast Alaska, and the long-term health of our region and the state and the country depend on maintaining an intact national forest here. So, you know, we're going to push them as hard and make them make the right decision. We'll see what kind of decision they make, and that's, you know, we'll have that opportunity to take action if we must. But at this point, it's an opportunity to get people engaged about the Tongass, to get people contacting their representatives and senators and telling them that you care about the Tongass, and let the Forest Service know too. It's just going to keep going.
Thank you. Yeah, that's all really. Yeah. And just to be aware, for the audience, when you keep hearing the word EIS, it means environmental impact statement. So I just want to make that clear for those of you who aren't aware of that. And it's really interesting though, because there's so many environmental impact statements that I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of in this whirlwind of thinking of the insanity of not really speaking to the actual impacts that are occurring, and just this way of, I don't know if sugarcoating is the right word, but I mean, I think anybody who's listening can understand what the environmental impacts are for cutting the last remaining old growth in the world. I mean, and it's really amazing to me that this is even up on the table. And I'm just so grateful to all of you who are putting so much time and energy and attention to this issue that really, in my eyes, shouldn't even be an issue at this point. I mean, the Roadless Rule was figured out a couple of years ago. There's really so few reasons why we should even be questioning this. And so again, it's just so important that we continue to push back against this insanity, and also making a statement. And I do believe that the more victories that we can win in these types of public land fights, the better off that other public lands may be, because we really need a movement of people who are willing to constantly stand up for this. And one of the interviews I did this summer while I was in Anchorage was with a really wonderful woman, and she had said something like, you know, every generation has had to fight for public lands. This isn't something new, and it's also something that's not going to go away. That if we care about our public lands, we need to stay engaged and we need to be active. And this is actually just part of our, you know, so-called rent for living on this earth and for being able to protect these lands. It's like, this is just something that we actually have to be involved in, and nobody's going to do it for us. Yes, of course, you know, Buck and Bryn and Katie are fighting the good fight, but they can't do this alone. We really need to show up, and it's not something that we can just push off and hope that somebody else is going to take care of it for us. So I really appreciate the points of empowerment and really explaining to us the past, present, and potential future. So maybe that's a good question, or a good question to end on is, and this might be different for all of you, but what is a best case scenario, and what is a scenario if we don't rise up to meet this challenge? What are those two different paths that we're looking at?
Well, I think that regardless of how this situation ends up, as Buck spoke to earlier, you know, if they do actually essentially repeal a lot of these, or roll back a lot of these protections that we have through the National Roadless Rule, you know, we've done that before, and it's been a huge amount of work, and we've had to do a lot of work on individual timber sales to really take a hard look at those. And regardless of if the rule is there or not, it's a bad deal for everyone. And so the realities of that are not going to go away. It's still going to be bad for taxpayers. It's still going to be bad for our economy. It's still going to be bad for a lot of our lifestyle here in Southeast Alaska. And so a best case scenario would, of course, be that somehow we come out from this with a stronger roadless rule that actually gives additional protections to the Tongass. If the state gets their way, of course, that's not going to be, and we suspect that that would not be what actually happens, but it could mean a lot of work for us in the future if they do come back and say that that these different issues should be, the protection should be removed from the Tongass. But, like I said, we're just going to keep up the fight, and hopefully that we'll be able to do just like we did back in 2003 and really uphold the integrity of the forest, or at least some of the most critical parts of it.
I used to have red hair now, and now I've got silver hair. So I don't want to go back there to say it's, this is the time, I think, for people to be engaged. By participating in the process, you can send a message. Don't forget your elected leaders. We have an election coming up. It's going to be a game changer, I hope. We'll see. But that'll empower Congress to maybe step in and stop the funding for the crazy ideas like this, and to save taxpayer money by ending spending on this rulemaking. So there's a lot of things that can happen, and we just have to keep the pressure on. So let your leaders know that you care about the Tongass. You can go on their webpage and let them know that you listen to this webcast and you're concerned and what's going on. What are they doing for you? And just elevate this issue. Every bit helps. Every voice counts.
Yeah, that's so true. That we definitely need to elevate every voice. And one of the long-term effects of this, even if the state goes through and obtains the exemption that they want, is going to be in the face of an outpouring of outrage from both Southeast Alaskans and also the national public about what they're doing and not paying attention to the people that are really speaking up and saying, look, you can't do this to our forests. So if anything, it's going to bring a lot of awareness to the Forest Service that they really need to shift their focus from timber production and using timber metrics as a metric for success, like how many board feet you put up for sale this year. That's not the measure of how the Forest Service is doing these days. They need to be measuring their success in terms of salmon streams that were rehabilitated and how many, watershed did they restore? How much land did they thin for wildlife that's been degraded in the past? And, sort of demonstrating to the Forest Service that Americans really care about the new economy of Southeast Alaska and the integrity of our forests in general. That's going to be a benefit, however this process ends up. I think if enough people are able to come forward and say, focus on the new economic drivers for Southeast Alaska, it's the visitor industry, it's commercial fishing, and we want to see progress on those terms. Hopefully there will be a shift towards the entire agency to do that.
Yeah, yes. Well, this has been so wonderful and empowering and educational, informative. And I just want to thank the three of you so much for being on late night, talking about the Roadless Rule and public comments and all of that. And I really also want to highlight your organization. So if you could both, or all of you, please tell us, where people can find, what your websites are, how to get more involved with SEAC and SES, and just want to be able to give people a place to go to learn more about the work that you all are doing.
So for SEAC, we're the Southeast Alaska Conservation Council, and our website is seac.org, so seacc.org, and we're on Instagram and Facebook. And so signing up for our emails and making sure to stay engaged in that way. We of course post everything to social media as well, and so really, staying on top of these issues and making sure that regardless of the fact that this is a 2-year process, we need to stay engaged throughout. And there's so many different things coming down the pike, especially with our political sphere being the way that it is, that it's really important to stay engaged in these issues and not just in the beginning, but really keep up the pressure throughout. And so for both organizations, hearing from us and making sure that you get our updates are a really important piece of that.
Definitely. I think staying engaged is a really important point to build on what Bryn said there. If anything positive has come of the election of the Trump administration, it's that a huge part of America that was previously just sort of, okay with decisions being made for them and, sort of assuming that their leaders were doing it for the public good, we woke up and we realized that wasn't the case anymore. And if we want to protect what's important to us, we need to speak up, and we can't stop speaking up. We can't go back to sleep because it's in our face every day. So staying engaged is, like we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, it's not a choice anymore. You have to stand up to protect what you love and what you care about. And so, I would totally agree on that front. You can find us at sitkawild.org, and we're also on Instagram and Facebook as Sitka Wild. And, support the local organizations that are doing the work. Sign up for the action alerts and the emails, the newsletters, so you can stay informed on what you care about. And really, lend your voice to amplify the voices of others, because every voice does count. And it's important to just have as many people as possible speak up about this, because, together we can be a roar. So thank you for having this webinar with us.
I love that. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in, and stay in touch with SEAC and SES. There's a lot of important stuff that's going to be coming out over the next year, and it's really going to be mandatory if you want to do something about the Roadless Rule to stay involved and engaged. So thanks everyone, and have a beautiful evening.